Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Tuesday webinar, today focused on mending our community fabric, rebuilding trust with our communities and those around us. I'm Melissa Matarazzo, a leader coach with Huron Student Education, and I'm delighted to be the host for our session today. As is evidenced in our title and in the work that many of you may be aware of us doing with leaders and organizations around the country, we're focused on bringing the 9 principles for organizational excellence into action. And so today, in particular, we'll be focused on Principle 3, building a culture around service, and Principle 8, communicating at all levels. While you'll probably hear things that relate to the other principles listed here, our focus is primarily on service and communication as we seek to rebuild trust. Through the course of our session together, we'll start applying an oldie but goodie framework that I hope will help you analyzing some of the conflicts and challenges in your communities. Then we'll highlight Stephen Covey's work on influence and control and determining where to select to make our actions, to choose actions that can influence the situation. And then we'll close by returning to leadership fundamentals. And as I'll talk through today, this is a combination of a heart seminar and a mind seminar. We're going to be talking through both the emotional and the tactical sides of leadership, and hopefully offering you some ideas for how to tackle the challenge before us. I probably don't need to make too much of a case for the challenge that is before us. This erosion of trust that many public organizations, schools included, have been seeing is challenging in everyday work. And in many cases, it's even causing people to question their purpose and how they are making a difference in practice. And it might be politics, it could be safety, but there are a number of things in recent years, in addition to the trauma of our experiences through a pandemic, that have led to less trusting and more conflicting environments. And in case you feel like it's just you, just to be clear, this is occurring in communities across the nation. And while we won't necessarily ever say that you're at fault or that we've done something wrong, I really hope people would stay away from that thinking. It is the product of what's been going on, and we can do something about it. And in fact, I would suggest that educators and others are best poised to lead the way forward. So as you get ready for the content ahead, I'd really encourage you, there may be many things happening across your community that are evidence of mistrust or polarization or conflict. But as you think through them, I'd encourage you to pick just one to use as your thinking example as you listen today. So I'll give you a moment to think about what's one particularly challenging conflict or area of mistrust with you and your communities that you would like to be thinking through as we talk today. You might jot it down, you might doodle it somewhere, or you might just hold it in your head before we move forward. Okay. I imagine for many of you, it's not a matter of are there instances of this, but which one to focus on. And surely you can take other examples through the activities we'll do in the coming moments. So I'd like to also be clear that this is pretty much how I confront conflict. And so in engaging in this learning today together, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that I am the be-all, end-all expert. In fact, all of my personality types suggest a hesitance in dealing with conflict and a desire for peacefulness, stability. And so part of what's driving me these days in offering my suggestions to you is that that we have to make our way through this. We can't go around it. And so even those of us who are as reticent as this little one here to engage in what might be difficult conversations or dialogues, that we really do need to. And the way I think to get entry into how you will tackle those particular situations in your setting is to go back to your heart, to the core purpose that brings you to this. I think making our way beyond mistrust and building back, mending that fabric is going to have to come from the heart. And I'll also say that I know many folks who are leading at this moment are tired. And so it can be hard to reconnect there, to feel in your heart of hearts strong and confident. But I hope you find that space, and I hope you find it soon, so that you can feel connected to the human that you are, the person that cares, that got into a profession that cares deeply for people, and that your actions and your words can be spoken from that true place. With that being said, you'll notice the authors of this quote are also authors of a pretty technical approach to analyzing leadership in organizations, which is what I'm going to introduce next. So there's this balance, I think, in the work we're about to undertake in building back trust between how our heart and our emotion can play a really significant part, our commitment, and then how there are tactical, analytical tools that we can use to help us really get to a better ending, a better outcome. So the first tool I'll share is one that's likely familiar to many folks, and that is the 4 frames of leadership, or the 4 frames of organizations, written about by Bowman and Deal many years ago now. And while the slide has a lot of information on it, I'm introducing or reintroducing this framework to you because I think it's valuable to analyze the conflicts and challenges we're having through all 4 lenses here. And by that I mean that many of us have a tendency to think about the world through one or more of these more often. So from my perspective, I tend to be more structural and political. I tend to think about how are our structures either creating mistrust or could be moved to create better trust, and how are the ways in which power is experienced and influenced and interacting between groups, how is that having an impact? That being said, it's really important when we're considering something like rebuilding our communities' togetherness, to also be thinking about what are the symbolic representations out there and how could they be impacting the things that people are feeling and experiencing. And how do we care for our humans and ensure the capacities, the skills, the opportunities for folks to be able to help us on this journey. So when you think of your current area of mistrust, or an area where there's conflict across groups, perhaps within or outside of your organization, I would use these lenses to just ask some deeper questions about what's the cause, or what might be contributing to or influencing the way in which people are interacting. So I'll pause here on this slide because there are a series of questions for each of the frames, so that you can get out of maybe your default or the one you're most familiar with, and also look at the situation from some different perspectives. So for example, in the structural realm, is there something about the way our organizational structure or our role definitions occur that are impacting people's trust for us? When we think about the human resource piece of this, we're often thinking about skills people need, but what's the innate human need, perhaps, that's causing people's actions, words, and how they interact with each other? Interesting from a political lens, and this is a lowercase p, in the sense of, have we thought about the opportunity for coalition and building people back together bit by bit? or even thought about what are people feeling in competition for? What do they think they might be missing out on? And whether that's something in our control or not, which is what we'll get to next, it might be really helpful to consider that. And lastly, I think about the symbolic realm and that lens around, are there symbolic things in our culture and our community that might be miscommunicating or building additional mistrust? Are there practices, and this is a great time as our experience of COVID-19 perhaps becomes more endemic than pandemic, for us to think about what are some of those rituals or practices that brought togetherness that we haven't been able to do that we need to get back to, of course, safely. But people need some inspiration. And I do think trying to get underneath what would inspire some of the folks with which you're having these conversations could be really helpful. So certainly consider whether one or more of these questions or others that might feed into this could be helpful to you. Once you've done that and you have a sense of perhaps multiple frames and how they're impacting the situation, you'll have a lot of information. You'll have identified deeper areas of where this situation is impacting people and what's impacting the outcomes that you're currently seeing. Instead of getting overwhelmed by all of that information, this is where I'd really bring you back to the circles of influence and control and be thoughtful about these, what I consider sort of 3 levels of situations. And I'll start at the top. There are certainly things that happen around us, that happen within our communities or beyond, that we don't control or influence. And whether or not we want to accept it, I do think acknowledging some of the things that are our current reality is really important, and we have to be honest with ourselves. But frankly, there are still many things in that second circle that you can exert influence on, whether as leaders or in just your work in communities. I think it's really thinking about the term influence because you have some. And one of our next thoughts is to think about how do we use it and how do we use it most wisely. There are things within our control, as Covey really points out in this graphic. Much of that is ourselves. And so as I started in encouraging us to think about our heart and where we stand, where we want to be in these situations, it is ourselves alone pretty much that we have full control over. And most of us in leadership have learned that, but it's still important to be reminded. So my thinking is, if you take your lenses of the frame and then you apply this concept of what we control, influence, or need to accept or acknowledge is out of our control, you could actually do some really good critical thinking around what to do next. So I'll take one example that I know is a challenge in many communities in all different states, and that is, the disruption and disagreement around library books that should be available to students pre-K through 12. And so there are multiple sides and multiple arguments that might be impacting a school district at the moment. And so when I think about that, and I think of a district I'm working with where one of the impacts has been staff feeling frustrated, like they're not able to participate in a debate or the debate is not headed in the direction they believe in. And they're getting questions, right? So parents or community members, colleagues will bring up things and they may not even know the policy or the practice around that particular issue. So if we think about it from a human resource lens, there are people who could be carrying a clear, concise message from the school district and how we, as a district, treat people fairly and equitably and are providing important information for students. We could train people to have better responses ready So they don't feel, if you're a librarian, under attack or feel as if they aren't able to engage in discussion. When it comes down to it, if that is a place where we can have impact, what's in our control as leaders of an organization is good training, is developing ways to support people who get stuck in the middle of some of these conversations in the workplace. What we could do even more than control is encourage people. Turn to our best communicators and ask them to be more present in the conversation. There may be ways in which we can share messages that people proactively push further out to reach more participants in this way. At the end of our work, there are things beyond our control, and we can't control other people's reactions. We can't control their emotions. And so both of these examples, and I just started with the two lenses or frames here, thinking about the actions within your control or influence is one way, I think, to narrow your attention to a tangible, explicit next step. And, it's interesting. I'm thinking too that this is work where the right next step may be as far as we plan. In other words, we won't move from a culture of distrust or mistrust to a fabulously collaborative and integrated community culture quickly. And if we set that as our target, we may be challenged. So let's think about how to make our next actions manageable and take them one step at a time. So now I'll turn to the leadership fundamentals, which might actually fill in some of the boxes in this chart. So within the human resources or the symbolic or any of the frames, some of our basic leadership fundamentals will be essential. That's asking, listening, and following through. So those are the core three. You know them well, you do them well. You might want a little refresher, and it can be hard, as I mentioned, to continue to listen to challenging perspectives and dissatisfaction, but you can do it. So I wanted to encourage you to think about the questions you're asking or how you're asking for input, feedback, insight, etc. At the top of the screen here, you see some common practices. Rounding, which is intentional conversation with people to assess where they're at, what's working, what's not, and give you good input for next steps. Doing simple plus deltas, particularly around situations where people maybe see things from different perspectives, to say what has been effective, what might we need to change to have a better outcome. These can be used as methods of asking. And the questions below really allow you to see that you could be asking at all different levels. So there are sometimes we're really interested in people's perception. What do you think about this? How are you feeling? Why are you feeling this way? That kind of thing. At the same time, you might be asking less for information and more for what can I help with? What do you need from me that would help this situation? And again, if you ask, you will have to respond, but you don't necessarily have to say yes. And certainly understanding what is the expectation of us can be important information for us. So this is just a reminder of the things that we know to do well as leaders, to be engaging with people, and doing so even with folks where there may be strong emotion or there may be dissatisfaction. We can be brave and courageous enough to bring our heart to those conversations. After that, it's really the skill of listening and doing so in a way that enables you to get the most information that you can. And you may realize this is a slide I borrowed from a colleague of mine who did a webinar recently because it was just that good. I have gotten very out of practice at halting and really stopping the other activity to be a good listener. trying to enjoy, to ask of myself as I'm listening to things, even things that are very hard to enjoy, but to really be in the conversation and in the communication you're receiving. And very often reflecting back, validating what you've heard, helps people feel listened because they hear their words coming from your mouth. And so even if you are pretty sure you got it right, sometimes just the acknowledgement of the words that they have used coming from you can be super significant. So after you're listening, and it's really critical that we take the steps to follow through. And this Calvin and Hobbes is so reminiscent to me of these situations that we're in or that we find ourselves in often. There's two parts about this cartoon that I want to bring to life. The first and most obvious, I think, is what we don't want to have happen, which is we start a monumental task. We get bored, or probably in these situations more, we get tired, we get frustrated, we don't see an impact, and so we pause or we stop altogether. And obviously, we want to avoid that whenever possible, even if going forward is smaller than we envisioned at the beginning. And that's the second part of this. I wouldn't encourage us to set out to make a monumental, heroic community transition back to joy and peace and interrelatedness. Let's start small so that we can find moments of impact in taking those small steps. It can add up in the end to the revitalization of the relationships across your communities, but start small and start. Following through can also look like just communicating about what it is you have done or aren't able to do or are working to do. The stoplight report of any type can be very helpful for letting people know we heard, we're taking action, and there may be things we have to communicate that we can't or can't yet take action on, but at least people know that listening occurred. The other thing is just to produce summaries, ways in which once you've had listening or conversational sessions, you're demonstrating what you've heard and what might happen next. So different methods are always available for pushing back out. And part of follow through is acknowledging what you've heard and what might happen next. I think the last thing after asking, listening, and following through that really strikes me when it comes to trust is trust and reliability come from consistency. And especially at a time when so much has been inconsistent for so long, I think people are yearning for some level of routine and reliability, and you can offer that with some careful planning and attention. What I would encourage you when we think about the frames of leadership to be clear on is if you're going to consistently engage, make sure that there are people to whom you return regularly to get a fuller picture of a situation. Don't drop a group or let go of a particular conversation if you can avoid it to keep this ongoing relationship. Important that if we are perhaps engaging with different groups of people, different individuals, that there's consistency in what we ask them and how we interact with them in the answers we give. And that means more than just myself as leader, but my team, trying to show some consistency so that people come to trust that we will be who we say we are. And again, that follow up and follow through, really important as well. So as for many of you coming to the close of a school year and beginning the next one, I think gives you an opportunity to use some tools to help with your consistency. So thinking forward to perhaps an action you might take around your area of mistrust or conflict you identified earlier. How can you build your calendar heading into the next academic year to build in, I want a regular time with this, I want a regular time here, and try to be ready in advance, get it out there. What you fill it with is going to be up to you and a product of your listening, of your asking and listening. Um, and then get prepared. You know, some sessions with different individuals or groups are more challenging than others, and really readying yourself so your heart can be present, your emotions are there, but they don't overtake. That requires prep, both for yourself and others. And then something I do have to tell myself when I get overwhelmed and I'm having a hard time being consistent is late is better than never. So as you're working your way through the steps you might take in response to what you've learned from your analysis here, ensuring that even if it can't happen as consistently as you like, that you do continue to follow through and follow up, it really matters. So with that, I have offered a number of frameworks and points of reference for you to consider as you bring your heart out into the world in a way that will enable folks, hopefully, to feel and be more trusting of the opportunity and more trusting of their relationship with you. First steps are important steps. And so I thank you for even attending today to take advantage of some ideas that we have shared. Thank you.